I'm going to give you a brief presentation discussion about ecosystems and what we see happening within them. And this is the collective work of a lot of our team, which is, as we start to think about how we architect the invisible, how we start to design these types of communities, we start to come up with certain themes over and over and over again. And so we wanted to be able to share some of our latest thinking on this as a group with you, and that's what this is here. And hopefully as we provide this information, it provides a framework for you to carry for the next couple days and maybe on into the year. So let's go ahead and get started. So the presentation starts with, when it goes up there eventually, a picture of a door. So at some point, this presentation will go up there. There we go. So this is the door that you might recognize. It's on the cover of the books. And it's this idea that we know we're in kind of a world that's very predictable. And when we think about economic development, we think of management, we think of leadership tools. They're very much like boxes. They're very much like rooms. And so our goal is really to try to open this door and try to get through it. And so let's try to walk through this door together and try to think about what is it that causes systems to thrive. Not just individuals, not just large organizations or institutions, but what is it about systems? And we're going to use Silicon Valley as a model for us. Not that everything about Silicon Valley is perfect. There's a lot of excesses of Silicon Valley in the last couple of years, a lot of too many reality TV shows for my comfort. But if you look back historically, what caused this vast explosion of wealth? I think something like half of the wealthiest zip codes in the US are based in the Bay Area. So there's something about this place that's caused this kind of wealth creation over the years. So what is it? Let's try to dissect this a little bit. And can we replicate that magic? So if we understand it, then we can start to think about how we can construct and design that type of dark matter in new places. Dark matter, by the way, I give full credit, that's a phrase from Tom Guevara of the US Economic Development Administration, which is, he came up with, which I really like. And so we're going to keep using this phrase. So I'm going to start, though, with a can opener. And this is sort of an interesting way to start a conference presentation. But this idea that this is a can opener that was developed in 1925. It's called the Butterfly. And it was a big innovation at the time because it had this round serrated thing that you use. All of us grew up with these, right? Pretty much all of us. All of us pretty much hated these, right? They're pretty terrible to use. And so we went for decades, about 60 years or so, before this can opener started to change. And now we have can openers that actually are a lot more comfortable to use. And this is a big shift over time. And so what happened was this thought that, well, if you look at how real people use these objects, and you look at the interface, what is it about us human beings as awkward creatures, our imperfections, our constraints, and you look at the things we're trying to achieve, what's getting in the way? And that's design, right? That's how we think of the interface between what we are and what we're trying to achieve. This is the same thing we've applied to things like buildings. So we think of architecture, for instance. This is a building, Boston City Hall. It was designed and built in the early 1970s, and it won a bunch of awards. And it's sort of the height of modernist architecture. If this building could talk, what would it say to you? What's that? People are watching you, yes. In fact, the mayor's office was right there in the middle, watching over the city. It's strength, control, certainty, predictability. And that is modernist thinking. That was the idea that we had conquered the frontier. We'd conquered chaos. We knew how to run our civilizations. We knew how to build our city halls. And modernist architecture was great in concept because it really exalted science and technology and mathematics as true answers. But the problem with things like that, and the reason people hated Boston City Hall, including me when I lived there for a while, is because human beings are really, really tiny next to this. You feel really insignificant. There's no human scale to this building. And so modernist architecture, after that point, actually started to fade away. You don't see buildings built quite like this anymore because people don't like them. They don't feel human. And so there's a shift in architecture over the years. And I know we have some great architects in the room here, which is how do we use buildings to shape the environments in which we want to do business, we want to commute, we want to live our lives as human beings. And this is not just for buildings. This is also for the way we think about cities. So this is the modernist way of looking at cities. So this is Manhattan in New York, and some of you might recognize what used to be called East River Drive in Manhattan. And when the designer of modern New York, Robert Moses, said, well, how do we move things efficiently? How do we design mathematically the best way to create a city? He said, well, let's just create a highway that runs from the north to the south so we can move people and goods and create efficiency. And it's the same concept in cities, which is, it sounds great in theory. It sounds great when you're 30,000 feet in the air. But when you're actually on the ground, there's something else, which is you lose the waterfront. You lose a lot of life of the city. So there's no place to walk your dog, to take your family, to play beach volleyball. There's no place to live a life as a human being. But you might be able to move goods around, and people would debate how well that highway moves goods around and people around. But you're missing something. And there's been a shift as well in cities. So as people think about, well, we can't just mathematically create our cities to be great places. We also have to think about them as livable places for human beings. And so places like Hong Kong, for instance, they did the same design with a highway on the waterfront, but they're rebuilding the beach. They're actually building parks in front of their highways to reclaim the life of the city. And this is happening also in many places. I think Buffalo, New York is doing the same thing. They're actually building out waterfront now because they miss it. And so there's a shift in how we think of these things, buildings, cities, objects. So it's what we call the evolution of design thinking, which is how have we shifted our notion of how we design the things in our lives. And so we can think originally of things like can openers, objects, industrial design. And that applies to all sorts of objects, not just household objects. Buildings, architectural design. How do we think of buildings in ways to serve as the interface between human beings and the communities that we're trying to create? And then urban design, how we design cities. And you see a big movement in how cities are created. They're more walkable, there's more central cores, they're places that people can live and take their families and enjoy life. So the question now is, well, what do we do about creating economic wealth? How do we design the ecosystems themselves? And this is the next great challenge of ours. So we are at a moment in history where this has become the primary challenge for us. And this community of people here are really at the forefront of trying to figure out how do we do this well. The challenge with ecosystems is that they're invisible. We can't see them. They're untouchable. They're the connective tissue that bonds us as a human society, but they're in the air. We don't know how to put our hands on them. And so the question then is, as a group, how do we architect this invisible infrastructure? So how we got here, I'll give you just a really brief snapshot of how we got here, which is the industrial era thought of making things as a form of mass production. You create wealth by scaling up, by creating objects that could be replicated. You had a few people who were smart enough to design something, and you had a bunch of other people that could replicate and make it. This is, in World War II, the making of airplanes. Assembly line process, scaling, and making up. Replication. And when we think about the modern economy, though, we reach this fundamental conclusion, which is there's a difference between a plantation and a rainforest. In a plantation, you're making something that you already know. You're farming a crop that you've already predicted. So you're trying to make airplanes for World War II. So you just try to make as many of those airplanes as you can for as cheap as possible. That's farming. That's plantation. That's production. But in rainforests, we encounter something else. Because on a farm, when you have a weed, what do? Well, you kill the weed. You don't want weeds. You don't want unpredictable things. But in rainforests, what's a weed? Well, everything's a weed. Everything is unpredictable. And in rainforest environments, that weed could grow up to become the most valuable thing in the entire forest. And you think of around here in the valley, companies like Facebook and Twitter 8, 9, 10 years ago. What were they? Were they crops that you were planning to grow, or were they weeds that grew organically? They were weeds. And so the question then is, well, you can't grow more rainforests by planting more trees. You have to design the environment. So you create environments that allow weeds to grow. But you run into this really big paradox when you do this, which is that plants are harvested most efficiently on farms. You can create crops at great efficiency in plantations. But weeds sprout best in rainforests. And so these environments are very different from one another. The environment for innovation, where weeds can grow, is very different from the environment where you're trying to replicate and scale. And what we know about rainforests is it's the serendipitous interactions between all the moving pieces. It's the interactivity and interconnectivity of everything. So it's not just having money, it's not just having smart people, it's not just having great science, it's not having great institutions. It's the way they touch each other. It's the way individuals move around and connect serendipitously in unexpected ways that create that value. So can we design these types of environments that allow all these different pieces of a system to start touching each other in efficient and productive ways? So the secret of rainforests really is actually quite simple. We find that in innovation systems, they thrive when culture is able to overcome social barriers and foster connectivity, trust, and collaboration between diverse people. There's a lot of research behind this now. All the social science research, all the hard science research shows that this is actually true. But we could actually stop the conference here if the theory was enough. The hard part now is figuring out what to do about this, and how do we implement these ideas? How do we actually turn concepts about where innovation comes from into the practical reality of building systems? And when we think about places like Silicon Valley, it's actually a very useful place to be, because we can start to look into the culture of this place, and the history of this place, and the people of this place, and see what actually happened. Not just something out there in a zoo, we can actually come and experience it and see it in real time. Because it's not a place at all. It's actually just a state of mind. And the great thing about states of mind is that they're free. You should be able to build and create states of mind. And so one of the things you'll have noticed in this conference is that we've actually designed states of mind. The whole way this conference is shaped is meant to be a giant design laboratory to apply this thinking to the process of building a system ourselves, building our own little rainforest for a few days. So when we think of the difference between rainforests and plantations and the need to grow weeds as they turn into crops, we find some interesting things. So weeds, starting on the left, have to grow into crops. This is business. Right? You start small, you prototype, you experiment, it works, you scale up. So how do weeds turn into crops? Well, when we look at this, we find certain things, which is that on the left, you have the rules of the rainforest. These are the rules of innovation. They're on the bookmarks that the wizards gave you earlier today. And if you didn't get one of those, they're in the bags that we gave you as well. And it's the idea that there are certain fundamental core values and social contracts at place in innovation systems that are highly vibrant. And you find these rules throughout the valley. Break rules and dream, open doors and listen, trust and be trusted, seek fairness, not advantage, experiment and iterate together, err, fail, and persist, and pay it forward. These are core to the experience of entrepreneurs in the valley, and they go back historically. They go deep into the health of the valley. And if you look at the work of Annalise Saxenian, you look at the work of Steve Blank, who's going to be talking here in a second, you see these ideas permeate all this work. Now, the interesting thing is, on the right-hand side, we also have the rules of the plantation. These are the rules of production. And here they are. 1, excel at your job. 2, be loyal to your team. 3, work with those you can depend on. 4, seek a competitive edge. 5, do the job right the first time. 6, strive for perfection. And 7, return favors. Now, if you remember the business literature from 20, 30 years ago, they talked about a lot of these things. And if you look at these, they're actually paired up. 1 pairs up with 1, 2 pairs up with 2, 3 pairs up with 3, etc. And they pull in opposite directions. If I started this conference and I said the rules of the right are the rules of the rainforest, you probably would have nodded and said, yeah, that sounds pretty good. You excel, excellence, loyalty, etc. That all sounds pretty good. But the rules on the left pull you towards unpredictability, towards chaos, towards creativity. The rules on the right pull you towards predictability, replication, scale, production, dependability. And so it's very interesting because we have rules, we can live in these bifurcated ways. We can live with 2 sets of rules at once, and they actually pull you in 2 different ways at the same time. And you can even reduce these down even more. So if you actually take these rules and just break them down into single words, values, you end up with things like openness, diversity, serendipity, fairness, experimentation, play, and giving. And on the right, you get excellence, loyalty, dependability, success, quality, precision, and reciprocity. Again, they pull in opposite directions. So this is very interesting because it means that culture values the social contracts that we hold when we engage in day-to-day business actually have a profound effect on the innovation process. Rainforests are guided by certain values, and plantations are guided by other values. And it's the intersection point that matters, because startup companies that stay on the left side all the time never make it to the next year. They die very quickly. Large companies and institutions that stay on the right side become dinosaurs. They fail to innovate. And so we've come up with these tools to build rainforests, and we didn't make these up ourselves. These are actually borrowed from psychology. There's a whole field of cognitive behavioral psychology on how people change their behaviors that are ingrained over many years. And they're ideas that you see embedded in all the work that you do. You learn by doing. So you don't learn in abstraction, you actually practice. 2, you enhance diversity. 3, you celebrate role models and peer interaction. 4, you build tribes of trust. 5, you create social feedback loops. 6, you make social contracts explicit. And these are things that you know, because you're doing this work in a lot of the projects you're doing, whether you're building an incubator or an accelerator or a university project or a government institution, or you're yourself in private practice, you're in a corporation or building your own company. You see these things happening because you know that they're actually what drive the innovation process. And this leads us to this paradigm, which is you have an old world where we controlled production to a new world where we create teams together. In the old world, you'd create clusters and think that was enough. On the right, you realize in the new world, we have human connectivity. Instead of never failing, we find ways to fail fast and cheaply. Instead of saying it's all about inputs and outputs into a system, we're looking at reducing social barriers to create interactivity. Instead of planning outcomes, we're looking for ways to experiment, adapt, and iterate. And instead of saying that things are morality neutral, we know that values actually matter. This is very profound. And people often ask, well, how do you do this? And this happens to be a class at Stanford that our colleague Ade has been part of for many years. But for 30 years now, they've been designing environments that cause the innovation process to be unleashed. Does that look like a rainforest or a plantation to you? It's absolutely a rainforest. And these same body of ideas, the body of ideas at the heart of the design thinking coming out of places like Silicon Valley, coming out of the companies here, coming out of the environment here, they've been embodied into a whole bunch of things, and they made it here today. So the same way we think about designing classrooms in places like Stanford are the same ways we've tried to design the environment here at this conference. And the same way we want you to learn how to be able to take this back out into the world in which you are doing business. So there's 3 words I'll share with you that seem to be themes that cut across all system thinking in the work we do. And they're just sort of recurrent themes. One is fear. Fear is a major motivator for people. We tend to be more motivated by fear than positive things. So fear, when you find people that don't want to take risk, they don't want to be entrepreneurs, they're afraid to meet people they don't know, they're afraid to work in teams of people that are uncomfortable. Fear is really what holds them back. So we deal with fear all the time in rainforest thinking and building ecosystems. Secondly, trust. The formatting was off, but you can trust. You have trust in your PowerPoint system. Trust, spelled T-R-U-S-T, is profound as well because it helps people overcome fear. When you trust your environment, when you trust the people around you, when you trust the situation, you're not afraid. So how do you build trust into these systems so that people aren't afraid, that they can actually be creative and they can do work together? And third is love. And this one's correct. Love is actually the motivator that drives so many things. When you talk to entrepreneurs, when you talk to inventors, when you talk to researchers, when you talk to builders and creators and artists, there's something there. They're not doing it because it's something they have to do. They're doing it because they're motivated by something much more intrinsic and much more profound. And all of us have these things. And so innovation thrives when you have systems that are able to tap that and to give people room to explore that love, that passion. Do they love their products? Do they love their teams? Do they love the mission? Do they love the work? Do they love the environment that they're working in? This is very profound as well. How do you design environments that really cause people to love what they do? And so instead of 3 words, I'll just reduce it to 2 words. So 2 words to describe why rainforests really matter. And it's very simple. It's that you matter. Now, when you look back on economic thinking for the past 150 years, what they said is that you actually did not matter. When you think of Boston City Hall, you think, well, you actually didn't matter to Boston City Hall. If you died, that city would go on just fine. And we know that's not true in our real lives. And we know that's not true in the creation and innovation process, because individuals have a huge impact on the system. 2 people sitting at a coffee shop could start the next great company that transforms the world. You just don't know it today at the time. And so individuals do matter. And so this is a big shift because we're moving from a paradigm in a world in economic thinking where we said, well, it's the abstract spreadsheets and institutions that cause all the decisions to be successful, to a world where we realize that individual actions, motivations, culture, behavior actually drive the effects of the system. So this is a big shift, and it's an important one because as we're here today, you have to realize that you matter. Your work today actually has a big impact. The way you treat others, the way you interact, the way you share has a big impact on the way your teams will function and the way that the whole conference succeeds. And so we're welcome the chance to have you here today to participate in that. Just very quickly to kind of go back to the beginning where I talked about New York City, we talked about Robert Moses and his design for creating efficient highways in New York. And if we go back all the way to Greenwich Village, part of the story I didn't tell you was that Robert Moses wanted to put a highway through Greenwich Village. He wanted to connect the highways on the east and the west sides of Manhattan together because he thought it would be more efficient. It'd be a better plantation. And what happened is that people fought back. You had folks like Jane Jacobs, probably one of the first great urban activists, urban designers, who said, that's actually not what causes cities to be great, and that's not where economic wealth comes from. It's actually the interactions of people on the street. It's the way that people share, the way they exchange, the way they create things together. And so today, Greenwich Village is Greenwich Village, and not only that, it infected the whole southern part of Manhattan with this culture because Robert Moses didn't get his way. So this idea that you can actually win, you can actually fight back against this old paradigm and actually create things of value and design systems of value has worked. And the fact that Greenwich Village is standing is a great example of that. So I'll leave you with just a few parting thoughts, which is when you're in these environments, you come up with a few really interesting conclusions. One, that handshakes actually are more durable than contracts. Right? And I'm a lawyer. So I know that handshakes are actually more valuable. Two, that altruism can be more efficient than selfishness. Because for a long time now, we've been taught that if everybody was selfish, the world would be fine. And we know in innovation, that's not true. Altruism actually is more efficient for innovation. And three, silly things like trust and dreams and love, they actually do power the world. So thank you for being here again, and really appreciate the opportunity to share this with you.